It was a weekend afternoon. Carter was stirred from his afternoon nap. These sounds weren't unfamiliar to him. He would hear them almost every weekend. They were the sounds of his neighbor, who lived across the street from him, boxing. Carter sat up. He raised a hand to part a section of the blackout curtains. Warm afternoon sunlight slipped through the crack into his house, drawing a divisive line between light and darkness on his fingers. It was normal to feel parched after waking up from an afternoon nap, and every day that he heard the boxing start, this parchedness would raise another notch. Carter crossed his legs and stretched his waist languidly, then slowly flipped over to pull open the nightstand drawer, taking out a monocular. The world in his eyes was instantly framed into a perfect circle, and the magnified image that entered his vision was the goose-yellow wall of a building. Carter lived in the suburbs. There were no high-rise buildings, only rows after rows of small two-storied houses. All the houses had yellow walls and brown roofs. Even the architectural layout was the same, visually pleasing in their uniformity. As such, when Carter gazed over from his bedroom, he was directly facing the bedroom of the person living across from him. The monocular was slightly off focus. He calibrated it for a moment. This time, the view of the opposite bedroom fully appeared within the circle. There was a road less than 8 meters wide separating the two-storied houses. A monocular with a 12 times magnification was sufficient to clearly see every detail of the opposite bedroom. The neighbor living across the street was a 20-something-year-old man, about 1.85 meters tall. Similar to Carter, he lived alone in a two-storied home. However, unlike Carter, he worked in the city and would leave half an hour before Carter every day. Therefore, despite having been neighbors for the better part of a year, they had never formally run into each other, or, to be accurate, Carter was deliberately avoiding him. If he ever happened to be going out at the same time as the other man, he would quietly sit inside for another 2 minutes and wait until he heard the roaring of the engine fade into the distance before leaving the house. Carter wasn't a social recluse. It was only that he had a hobby of voyeurism. He couldn't control his desire to peep into the lives of others. For example, if he passed by someone handicapped, he couldn't help but guess the reason behind it. For example, if a colleague kept yawning at work, he would unconsciously analyze the other's activities the night before. Perhaps these could be passed off as having a vibrant curiosity. However, even Carter knew that being unable to stop himself from using a pair of binoculars to spy on the opposite flat was crossing the line explainable by curiosity. He himself didn't want to be this way, so he had applied of his own volition to move into a sparsely populated community. The densely packed flat across his residence turned into a solitary young man. This discrepancy greatly reduced Carter's voyeuristic appetite, until the sounds of boxing came from the opposite bedroom. Thud, thud, thud. White bandaged fists slammed into a thick sandbag, the dull thuds particularly abrupt in this quiet community. Today, this neighbor was as generous as ever, wearing not a single stitch on his upper body. A vicious straight punch was thrown, rippling from the beautifully sculpted abdominal muscles to his lean arms, sending out a tremendous explosive force. At first, Carter wasn't aware that the neighbor opposite, who regularly clocked in and out of work on time every day, actually had such a wild side. He only felt that the deeply set features and upright posture that the man opposite had, along with the suit, gave off the impression of a social elite, conforming neatly with his aesthetic tastes. He guessed that the man was indeed a social elite. He drove a nice car with a price tag beyond what the ordinary working class could afford, and his coffee table was densely cluttered with reports. In the first few days, Carter didn't have anyone else to spy on, therefore could only devote his full attention to the neighbor living across the street from him. However, not long later, he began to find it dreary. Apart from that man's outstanding appearance, he was no more than another ordinary man among the masses who mechanically commuted to work every day, even causing him to lose his desire to peep in. Then the weekend came and the man went down to the yard, topless, smoking as he watered the flowers. The daylight of early morning scattered on his uncaring face, and the pale golden complexion behind the mist of water gave him an otherworldly appearance. Carter hesitated briefly, feeling that this sensual sight was incongruent with the image of a pedestrian office worker. When he saw the man boxing afterwards, the thought that this man was more than meets the eye was further affirmed. Before moving, Carter had already hardened his heart, ruthlessly throwing away his beloved high-magnification binoculars. But ever since he found that the neighbor who lived across the street from him was worth studying, he couldn't stop himself from buying a monocular again. He consoled himself. Compared to before, he was now only spying on one person. He had already made significant improvement. "Mr. Zack, are you home? We need your signature for the new community management plan. It won't take too much of your time." The shouts of two community workers interrupted the pounding of fists into the sandbag. Still hidden behind the curtains, Carter put down his monocular and gazed over towards the disturbance, to see that the two workers had come up to the iron fence of the opposite house. If Carter could hear him boxing, there was no reason that the two downstairs couldn't. By usual social conventions, since Mr. Zack had already exposed that he was home, he should reasonably have gone downstairs to receive them. But when Carter raised his gaze and looked levelly over, he saw that Mr. Zack didn't have the faintest intention of going downstairs. He stood in the shadows behind the window, drinking water as he indifferently watched the two people downstairs. With that posture, he was obviously pretending that he wasn't home. But pretending at this point was even more as if he was sending a clear signal: "Don't bother me." "Forget it, I knew it. He doesn't care about community matters." Seriously, how much time can a signature take? As the two workers grumbled, they walked up to Carter's house and pressed his doorbell. Unlike the way they had with Mr. Zack, it was obvious that they weren't sure if Carter was home, so they didn't directly call out to him. Due to his work at the prison, Carter had a more stringent standard for judging good and evil than normal people. He wasn't a patient man by nature, but to make up for his voyeuristic tendencies, he didn't mind showing people who weren't wicked at heart a little more patience, thus was willing to go down and give his signature. But the problem now was that he didn't want to draw any attention from the man across the street. The man's line of sight lingered on the two community workers. If Carter were to go over now, he would definitely enter the other's scope of vision, whereas he himself had absolutely no desire to make his presence known to the other man. With the door not opening for them, the two workers walked towards the next house. The boxing sounds opposite didn't start again. The man set down his mineral water bottle and undid the white bandages wrapping his hands. The afternoon sun was at its peak. The sunlight only reached the edge of the window, and the contrasting line between light and shadows cast squarely on his lower arm, following the circling motions of his hands, dancing across his skin. Carter picked up his monocular again and increased the magnification. He could see the fine beads of sweat lining the man's arms, as well as the floating motes of dust in the daylight. His already parched throat felt even drier now, and every breath brought with it a scorching ache. He was unsure why he was never able to restrain himself. He was willing to engage with the community workers but was unwilling to bump into the man opposite, precisely because the guilt he felt in his heart wouldn't allow him to look the other in the eye. He knew from very early on that the neighbor living across the street was surnamed Zack. But frankly, even this tidbit was superfluous to him. It was for the best that he treated the man like a male model in an erotic magazine, providing Carter with just enough fodder for his imagination when he rested his eyes in his downtime. That aside, Carter didn't need any real information about him. This was because should it traverse into reality, Carter's guilt would only deepen. He knew that his voyeuristic tendencies weren't something that he could curb overnight. So, the best solution was not to have any encounters with this man. After the summer solstice, the temperature gradually rose. The quiet community was free from the pestering noise and air pollution of the bustling city, and only the transient whistling as the scheduled trains crossed bridges into the distance could be heard. Carter didn't used to like summer days. The glaring sunlight and sticky sweat stains repulsed him. He basically would never go out under the hot sun to exercise, and even the convicted felons in prison would taunt him for having skin so fair that he didn't appear in the least bit like a prison staff. However, just this summer, Carter suddenly had a change of heart for the season. It wasn't for any bone-deep reason than that the hotter the weather grew, the more generous the neighbor living across the street became. In the past, his neighbor would typically change into plain indoor clothing after coming back from work. The loose and comfortable short-sleeved white shirts hid his enviable figure, the sight flat and insipid for Carter, peeping in on the sly. But in recent days, in light of the rising temperatures, the neighbor opposite started to go around topless in his house. There was actually once when Carter witnessed for himself, his neighbor topless in an apron as he seared steak. If it weren't for Carter self-professing to be a voyeur with a bottom line, he would have whipped out his phone to secretly photograph this visual delight. Had everything passed as normal, these uneventful voyeuristic days would have gone on indefinitely, but there was a day after work that Carter discovered that his neighbor was behaving a little abnormally. Southside Prison was situated in the city outskirts, no more than a 10-minute drive from Carter's house. Carter would clock off work punctually at 5 o'clock every day, whereas that social elite would only return home at 9 or 10 in the night. Today, as usual, Carter parked the car in the private garage in his yard. But when he got out of the car, he heard the sounds of boxing from across the street, more intense than ever before. He almost thought that his ears were mistaken, even purposefully going up to the bedroom to secretly peek over through a crack in the curtains. The other man really was boxing. And this was unusual, for today was a working day. What was even more abnormal was that the hands of the man weren't wrapped in white bandages. Every fist caused the sandbag to rock. Rather than practice, this looked more like a venting session. His expression was also different from usual. A ferocious scowl was present between his brows, and his gaze wasn't on the sandbag but trained on a certain spot ahead, like his mind was elsewhere as he boxed. It shouldn't be anything good, Carter thought to himself. The man's agitation was palpable. Carter involuntarily started to guess what had happened. Perhaps he had lost his job, which was why he would be boxing at home in the early evening of a working day. As for why he lost his job, maybe he had sexually harassed a colleague. Hang on, why did his mind leap to sexual harassment? Just because his neighbor oozed sensuality didn't mean that he could tag indecent stereotypes onto him. Carter retraced his steps, contemplating what reasons there could be for this social elite to lose employment. Right then, the man opposite suddenly stopped, holding his two fists before his chest, inspecting his hands. There seemed to be something on his hands. Unable to make out what it was, Carter could only take out his monocular. Once focusing it on the target and magnifying the visual, Carter could clearly see the specks of blood on the man's joints. This wasn't strange. That guy had brought it onto himself for not wearing his bandages. It was only natural to break skin from the force with which he used to box, but the scene that appeared next stunned Carter. After staring at his hands for a while, the man suddenly stuck his tongue out, licking the wounded joints. The curious sight of this caused Carter's heart to stutter. He unconsciously set down the monocular, but less than a second later he couldn't help but raise it again, continuing to observe the actions of the other man. The ruthless expression from earlier had vanished, replaced instead by a tranquil calm that was without the faintest billow. The man appeared to have fully vented his rage through his boxing, and now his face was utterly expressionless. Even so, Carter could tell that his mind was preoccupied. At this moment, it looked closer to cold calculating. Carter had always been astute at reading people. Yet to his surprise, at this very moment, he was actually unable to discern the other man's emotional state. He thought of the most dangerous convicts in the prison. This man's expression as he licked the blood was a mirror image of those convicts, and he couldn't stop the budding suspicion that formed. Exactly how many facets did this man have? On this night, Carter cast his monocular aside. He felt that he needed to stave off it for a bit, else he would die of curiosity about this neighbor living across from him. He passed the rest of the night watching television. The various media platforms successively broadcasted recent news concerning a financial crime case that shook the nation's economy, in which an investment management firm was suspected of maliciously shorting dozens of stocks, unlawfully profiting by nearly $100 million. The case was still under investigation at present. The preliminary investigation revolved around the individual activity of each manager. Cases occurred day in day out. The prison had no shortage of fresh faces. Disinterested, Carter turned off the television and read a book until 11, then routinely got ready to go to bed. The watch placed on his nightstand was once again 2 minutes behind standard time. This was a common failing of mechanical watches, that they'd often go off with the ticking of time. It wasn't as if Carter couldn't afford a new watch. Conversely, the salary for prison work was much higher than regular office jobs. He was simply reluctant to change from the watch that his parents had given him. After all, this watch could somewhat count as a family heirloom. Winding the clockwork spring was a job that demanded patience. Carter spent a long time winding it. However, when he was almost done, the sound of a dislocated spring suddenly twanged from the dial, and in the next second, the knob in his hand suddenly loosened. Brilliant. He broke the spring from winding it. After deliberating for a fleeting moment, Carter concluded that this shouldn't be anything major, and thus got down to fixing it himself. 2 hours later, Carter flung the phone that was playing an instructional video aside, looking at the disorderly mess of watch components across the table with a headache. Sure enough, professionals were professionals for a reason. He really shouldn't have overestimated himself and impulsively tried to fix his watch on a whim. It was already past 1 in the morning. The street outside was dreadfully still. Despite being a young fellow of mere 27 years, Carter normally kept a healthy routine and seldom stayed up into the night like this. He turned off the ceiling light and laid down in bed. Out of habit, he lifted the curtains before he slept, glancing across the road. The goose-yellow building perfectly blended into the darkness. With only a lone street lamp quietly illuminating the night, Carter absently set the curtains down again. Yet for some reason, he kept feeling out of sorts, as if there was something amiss with the freeze frame in his mind's eye. So he raised the curtains again, and as expected, he caught sight of a dark figure furtively dithering outside the opposite yard. That dark figure checked his surroundings for a while and then nimbly scaled the moderately tall metal fence. The charge of criminal trespassing immediately came to mind. Carter sat up straight, staring fixedly at the figure's every movement. The black-clothed man first circled the house once, then went to its side, climbing up the water pipe to the second floor. That man should be a thief. Carter quickly formed a conjecture, but no more than a moment later he dismissed it, because the man in black was using some unknown tool to directly pry the window open and enter the bedroom. It was impossible that a thief would enter the master bedroom this flagrantly. After all, that would be the riskiest room. No matter what, it would only be fitting for him to rummage the living room downstairs instead. The surroundings were so silent that it seemed as though nothing was going to happen. Carter could only hear his thumping heartbeat, infinitely amplified in his ears. He grasped his phone, ready to call the police at any moment. But he left a little buffer time to wait and see if anything did happen. If his neighbor was able to react promptly to the intruder, then he wouldn't have to expose his presence. No voyeur would be willing to expose their presence in front of the person they were secretly observing. Carter was no exception to this. However, Carter had a slightly special background. Before working at the prison, he had worked as a court stenographer and was used to seeing all manners of trials in session on a usual workday. As such, he had formed a unique moral standard in his heart. Any misdeed must be recompensed. Take now, for example. After taking advantage of the neighbor living across the street for so long, he ought to lend a helping hand when needed. The few seconds of buffer time passed. The opposite bedroom remained pitch black. Carter rapidly called the police, but he was still unable to set his mind at ease. What if the man in black wasn't a petty thief, but of another sort? He had come into contact with many murderers in prison. Now, the word hitman inevitably surfaced in Carter's mind. Perhaps he was overthinking it, but it wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility. Even if the nearest local police station was within a 1-kilometer vicinity, a short 1 minute was more than enough for a life to be lost. Going on like this was too dangerous. He had to think of a way to awaken his neighbor. Carter didn't shout. After all, he was unclear of the identity of the man in black. He didn't want to call the danger over to himself. He looked all about him, grabbed hold of the ballpoint pen on his desk, and forcefully flung it at the opposite bedroom window, but the pen was too light. It whizzed over and clattered down to the yard. Carter had no choice but to search for a heavier object. He pulled the table drawers open and saw the ink bottle that was kept inside. The ink bottle slammed into the outside wall by the window, its body shattering into smithereens, unfurling an inky blossom on the pale-colored wall. Whether or not this had awoken his neighbor, Carter was certain that this would have caught the attention of the man in black. He no longer hesitated, grabbing the bottle of cologne that his ex-boyfriend had given him from the drawer. This time, the cologne bottle accurately smashed into the opposite bedroom, and less than a second later the lights turned on. Two shadowy silhouettes were cast on the thin curtains. One was half hunched over, whereas the other flipped out of bed, unhesitantly sweeping a kick over. Carter's two hands rested on the window frame, staring unwaveringly at the movements over there. In the pitch-black night, the scene before his eyes played like an open-air cinema. The light struck rectangular theater curtains, projecting a stimulating cinematic fight scene between two men. But if it really must be said, Carter's neighbor had the upper hand. His punches were not in any way sloppy, contacting solidly into flesh, dealing blows to the critical spots. Carter had some knowledge of fistfighting. When it came to his neighbor's fighting style, it would definitely be judged as a rule violation in international boxing tournaments due to its extreme brutality. The victor was soon determined. Concurrently, a police car pulled up from the distance. His job done, Carter let out a sigh of relief, drawing his curtains once more. However, just as he did so, he suddenly heard a loud crash. His curiosity moved him to raise a corner of the curtains again, and thus he saw that the bedroom window had been smashed through. The man in black was lying on the cement ground in pain with glass shards strewn around him, whereas his neighbor was holding the window frame with both hands, looking coldly at the scene downstairs. Carter couldn't help but find it strange. The man in black was being overwhelmed to the point of being unable to return blows. Were he to stumble down from the second floor, it could only be in an escape attempt. However, in that case, the window shouldn't have shattered. Another possibility occurred to Carter. His neighbor had knocked the intruder down from upstairs, and judging from the cold apathy on his face, it was very likely deliberate. In other words, he was utterly unconcerned as to the survival of the man in black. Recalling the way he had licked his wounds, Carter suddenly had a feeling that this man seemed to be even more dangerous than he imagined. Right then, as if abruptly remembering that someone had alerted him earlier, the man standing at the opposite window suddenly lifted his eyes without any warning whatsoever. His line of sight shot straight over like a falcon on the hunt, with dense vigilance in the probing gaze. Startled, Carter hurriedly let go of the curtain, hiding in the darkness,